1 mile south of the United States border, a concrete dam diverts the last of the Colorado River into an irrigation canal. Below it, the riverbed is dry. 90 miles of cracked earth stretch to the Gulf of California, where a 1,450-mile river that carved the Grand Canyon ends, not at the ocean, but in sand. This river serves 40 million people across 7 states. 80% of its water feeds agriculture. Some of it grows alfalfa shipped to Saudi Arabia, a country that banned the same crop at home to save water. The math was wrong from the beginning. That structure is called Morelos Dam. It sits near the town of Los Algodones in Baja California, and under normal operations, it takes everything the Colorado River has left and sends it into Mexico's Reforma Canal for farmland irrigation. Below the dam, the river channel is either a trickle fed by seepage or completely empty, dry for roughly 90 miles through what used to be one of North America's great wetlands. A 2-million-acre delta of cottonwood forests, marshes, and tidal flats that once teemed with birds, shrimp, and fish is now cracked mud, salt flats, and invasive tamarisk. 11 bird species have been lost from the region entirely. The Cocopah people, an indigenous community that fished and farmed these wetlands for generations, now live beside dry channels and polluted agricultural runoff. A man in San Luis Rio, Colorado, Mexico, once told a reporter that as a boy he swam in the river. Today, the channel beside his town is empty. The Colorado has not regularly reached the Gulf of California since approximately 1960. A river that once ran so heavy with red sediment that settlers called it too thick to drink and too thin to plow, now ends in silence, 90 miles short of the sea. Not because of drought alone, because every drop was promised to someone else, and the promises were based on numbers that were never real. The answer starts with a one-armed man in a wooden boat, 157 years ago. On May 24, 1869, Major John Wesley Powell and 9 men launched 4 wooden boats off a Union Pacific flat car into the Green River at Green River Station, Wyoming Territory. Powell had lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh. He was a geology professor at what is now Illinois State University, and the Colorado Plateau, the last blank spot on the map of the continental United States, was his obsession. The expedition would navigate more than 1,000 miles of the Green and Colorado rivers through canyons no American of European descent had ever charted. The boats were built of oak, heavy and stubborn, better suited to a lake than a whitewater canyon. Within the first month, in a stretch Powell named Lodore Canyon, one boat, the No Name, smashed against a rock and broke apart, taking with it 1/3 of the expedition's food and nearly all of its barometers. The men patched together what remained and kept going. Rapids had no names yet, so Powell invented them as he went. Disaster Falls, Hell's Half Mile, the camp of the wrecked boat. By late summer, rations had rotted to moldy flour and rancid bacon, and the men were rowing on hunger alone, uncertain whether the canyon ahead would open into calm water or swallow them whole. One man quit after a month. 3 others departed on August 28, 1869, scrambling out of the Grand Canyon rather than risk another rapid. They were never seen again. Powell and the remaining 5 emerged from the canyon into national fame. Congress awarded him $12,000 for a more thorough survey. He returned in 1871, this time bringing a photographer. And then he did something far more important than explore. He thought. What Powell found was a river that drained 246,000 square miles across the most arid landscape in North America. A river that carved the Grand Canyon, ran red with sediment, and swung violently between catastrophic floods and bare trickles. He also found a desert. In his 1878 report on the lands of the arid region of the United States, he delivered a warning no one in Washington wanted to hear. The lands west of the 100th Meridian were not suitable for the kind of agricultural settlement that railroad boosters and Eastern politicians were promoting. Water scarcity, he argued, would be the defining and limiting factor in Western development. The land laws designed for the humid East would not work in the arid West. The water was simply not there. In 1893, Powell reportedly stood before an irrigation congress in Los Angeles, a room full of Western developers, promoters, and land speculators, and said it again. According to Wallace Stegner's account, he was booed and shouted down. The audience didn't want a prophet. They wanted a pipeline. Powell spent his remaining years as the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey, largely sidelined by the very political forces he had tried to warn. He died in 1902. Within 2 decades, his own nephew would help build the system he had warned against. Arthur Powell Davis was the director of the Bureau of Reclamation and John Wesley Powell's sister's son. By the early 1920s, he was pushing hard for a massive dam on the Colorado River and for a legal agreement among the 7 basin states to divide its water. California was growing fast. Arizona was nervous. Colorado wanted guarantees. Everyone wanted a number, a fixed volume of water they could plan around. The man who proposed the mechanism was Delph Carpenter, a Colorado water lawyer. Brilliant, bullheaded, and deeply suspicious of federal control, Carpenter conceived the idea of an interstate compact, a legal agreement between sovereign states negotiated without Congress dictating terms. In January 1922, Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, was appointed by President Harding to chair the Colorado River Commission. Over the next 11 months and 27 official sessions, 7 state representatives argued over how to split a river. The final push came in November at Bishop's Lodge outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. For days, the delegates were holed up in an adobe retreat, wrestling over water. Hoover, the confident and self-assured mining engineer, pushed for expediency. Carpenter fought for state sovereignty. Arizona's representative, Winfield Norville, understood that the Colorado was his state's only major source of surface water, and that falling behind California could be catastrophic. On November 24, 1922, they signed a 4-page document called the Colorado River Compact. It divided the river into an upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and a lower basin, Arizona, Nevada, California. Each basin received rights to 7.5 million acre-feet per year. A 1944 treaty with Mexico would later add 1.5 million. Total allocation, 16.5 million acre-feet. Embedded in the negotiations was a decision that would echo for a century. Each representative asked for a fixed volume of water, specific gallons for specific acres, rather than a percentage of annual flow. This meant the compact assumed the river would always deliver the same amount. As one historian later put it, it was a lot easier to make a deal if they picked a big number. And the number they picked was based on flow measurements taken between roughly 1899 and 1921. Decades later, scientists at the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research would extract cores from ancient trees across the basin and reconstruct 500 years of Colorado River flows. What they found was damning. The period from 1905 to 1920 was one of the wettest stretches in at least 5 centuries. Flows during those years reached as high as 20 million acre-feet. The actual long-term average was closer to 15 million. And recent decades would bring actual flows closer to 12 or 13 million. Arthur Powell Davis, who supplied the flow estimates for the negotiations, reportedly selected the higher readings to make the deal attractive. Some historians argue he cherry-picked the data. In his defense, the lower numbers from the late 19th century could have been the anomaly, not the other way around. But a subsequent USGS report with revised lower projections appeared in 1925, 3 years after the compact was signed. By then it was too late. The nephew of the man who warned there was not enough water had helped divide a surplus that did not exist. The 7 states had signed a contract with a river that could not honor the terms. The next step was to build the dam that would make the contract physically real. In 1931, construction began in Black Canyon on the Arizona-Nevada border. The Depression was grinding the country down to bone. Unemployment hovered around 18%. Average annual income for a white male worker was roughly $1,400. Over 21,000 workers came from all 48 states, desperate for jobs that paid about $4 a day. The federal government built Boulder City, Nevada from scratch to house them. Homes, schools, a movie theater, a hospital. Gambling and alcohol were banned inside city limits. It was not a camp. It was an engineered company town in the desert, built for the sole purpose of building the dam. Summer temperatures in Black Canyon regularly topped 120 degrees. Men worked in shifts around the clock, in tunnels choked with truck exhaust and rock dust, on scaffolding suspended hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. A specialized crew known as the high scalers dangled from ropes to blast and clear loose rock from the canyon walls before construction could begin beneath them. Work so dangerous that some fashioned makeshift hard hats by dipping cloth caps in tar, predecessors to the modern hard hat still used on job sites today. Wages were good by Depression standards, but the work broke men in ways that rarely made the payroll ledger. The dam required 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a two-lane highway from San Francisco to New York. Engineers embedded 590 miles of cooling pipes inside the mass, because without them, they calculated the concrete would have taken 125 years to cool and cure naturally. The structure rose 726 feet, with a base 660 feet thick. When completed in 1936, 2 years ahead of schedule, Hoover Dam was the largest concrete structure on Earth, exceeding even the Great Pyramid of Giza in total mass. It cost $49 million. Behind it, the Colorado River backed up into a canyon and formed Lake Mead, the largest artificial reservoir in America. But the human cost was measured differently. The official death count was 96. Some historians place it as high as 120, because the official tally excluded workers who died off-site from injuries sustained on the job, and the dozens who perished from heat prostration and carbon monoxide poisoning inside the diversion tunnels. Six Companies, Inc., the consortium that built the dam, classified many tunnel deaths as pneumonia. The distinction mattered for liability. It did not matter for the dead. One coincidence has followed the dam like a ghost story. The first officially recorded death was J.G. Tierney, a surveyor who drowned in the Colorado River on December 20th, 1922, the same year the compact was signed. The last recorded death was his son, Patrick Tierney, who died on December 20th, 1935, during the dam's final stages, exactly 13 years apart, father and son bookending the cost. A persistent legend claims workers' bodies were buried inside the concrete. It is not true. The concrete was poured only 6 to 8 inches at a time, with dozens of workers watching each pour. But the legend survives because the dam feels like something more than engineering. A memorial plaque on the Nevada side, sculpted by Oscar J. W. Hansen, depicts a male figure emerging from water. The inscription reads, "They died to make the desert bloom." At full capacity, Lake Mead sat at an elevation of 1,229 feet above sea level. In 1983, an El Niño winter sent the water so high it nearly overtopped the spillways. The lake surface reached 1,225 feet. That was the peak. That high water mark is now the top of the bathtub ring. Hoover Dam was supposed to be enough. It was not. By the 1950s, the Bureau of Reclamation wanted more storage, more control, more dams. And the man driving that ambition was Floyd Dominy. Born on a failing Nebraska farm during the Dust Bowl, Dominy learned early that water meant survival. His first government job was as a county agent in Wyoming, helping ranchers build small, rolled-earth dams to water livestock. He built 300 of them in a single county. His rise through the Bureau was fast. driven by his tenacity, his cigar-chewing charisma, and his nearly religious conviction that a free-flowing river was a waste. He served as commissioner from 1959 to 1969 under 4 presidents, and contemporaries said he wielded more influence on Capitol Hill than any Secretary of the Interior. Marc Reisner in Cadillac Desert described him as General Patton with General MacArthur's ego doing Mulholland's work, which he considered the Lord's. In a 1997 PBS documentary, Dominy did not soften the image. "I have no apologies," he said. "I was a crusader for the development of water. I was the Messiah." His crowning achievement was Glen Canyon Dam, completed in 1963 on the Colorado River in northern Arizona. Behind it, Lake Powell formed, flooding hundreds of miles of sandstone canyons, side canyons, arches, alcoves, and thousands of years of indigenous cultural sites. Dominy called it progress. "The unregulated Colorado was a son of a bitch," he said. "It was either in flood or in trickle. It wasn't any good." David Brower disagreed. As executive director of the Sierra Club, Brower had fought the Bureau in the 1950s when it proposed dams inside Dinosaur National Monument. Brower even proved the Bureau's own evaporation calculations were wrong, using what he later called ninth-grade math, embarrassing the agency in front of a congressional committee. The Bureau backed off Dinosaur, but the price of that victory was silence on Glen Canyon. Brower agreed not to fight the dam there. He called it the worst mistake of his life. Glen Canyon, he said, was the place no one knew, a wilderness of extraordinary beauty, drowned before most Americans ever saw it. He called the loss his greatest failure. The conservationist's most celebrated tactical win produced his deepest personal wound. The flooding erased more than sandstone. Archaeologists estimate that Lake Powell submerged thousands of sites tied to ancestral Puebloan, Navajo, and other indigenous communities. Granaries, rock art, dwellings built into alcoves that had survived 1,000 years of desert weather, but not 8 years of rising reservoir. Some sites were surveyed hastily before the water came. Most were never surveyed at all. The dam that Dominy called progress was, for the people whose history it drowned, an erasure with no ceremony and no consent. Now, 60 years later, the canyons Dominy drowned are reappearing. Cathedral in the Desert and other formations are emerging from the dropping water as Lake Powell approaches what engineers call dead pool, the level at which water can no longer flow through the dam's outlets. The beauty is returning, but only because the system is failing. If you fly over the Imperial Valley of Southern California, the landscape tells the whole story in 2 colors. On one side of a canal, gravelly beige desert, heat haze warping the mountains into abstraction, scrub brush disappearing into sand. On the other side, an unbroken mat of bright green squares stretching to the horizon, rows of crops shimmering in 100-degree air. Everything green is Colorado River water. The Imperial Irrigation District holds the single largest allocation of Colorado River water in the entire system, roughly 2.6 million acre-feet per year. That is more water than Arizona and Nevada use combined. It irrigates about 1,200 square miles of farmland in a place that receives roughly 3 inches of rain a year. The farms sit on the silty soils of an ancient river delta. With near-constant sun and extreme heat, the valley grows crops virtually year-round. Imperial County reported $2.3 billion in agricultural sales in 2021, led by cattle and lettuce. 2/3 of the vegetables consumed in America during winter months come from this one valley. But about 1/3 of the district's acreage goes to alfalfa, a staggeringly thirsty crop used mostly to feed dairy cows and cattle. That alfalfa alone consumes more than 400,000 acre-feet of Colorado River water per year. That is more than Nevada's entire annual allocation of 300,000 acre-feet. One crop in one valley drinks more river water than an entire state receives. And the farmers hold the seniormost water rights on the river, first in time, first in right. That means they are the last to face cuts, The people who use the most water are the most legally protected from the crisis. By the end of the 20th century, the Colorado River was no longer a river in any natural sense. It was infrastructure, a plumbing system behind canyon walls and tourism brochures. Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam anchored the storage system. The All-American Canal carried water to Imperial Valley. The Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile aqueduct championed by Senator Carl Hayden, pumped Colorado River water uphill to Phoenix and Tucson. Los Angeles drank through the Colorado River Aqueduct. Las Vegas drew more than 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead. Las Vegas had about 126,000 residents when it started drawing from the reservoir in 1971. By 2015, the metro area had 2 million people and attracted 40 million tourists a year. The city averages about 4 inches of rain annually. The neon, the fountains, the swimming pools, the golf courses, nearly all sustained by a straw dipping into a shrinking lake. Lake Mead was designated the first national recreation area in America in 1964. Jet skis cut the surface. Houseboats lined the marinas. Families fished in coves. 80% of the river's water went to agriculture. The remaining 20% kept the lights on and the taps running for roughly 40 million people across 7 states and 2 countries. The law of the river, the interlocking web of compacts, treaties, federal acts, court decisions, and regulations governing the Colorado, was one of the most complex water management frameworks ever built. 30 federally recognized tribes hold rights to Colorado River water under a body of law separate from the 1922 Compact entirely. Rights established by a 1908 Supreme Court decision, Winters versus United States, which held that when the federal government created reservations, it implicitly reserved enough water to make them livable. Those rights, collectively, may total more than 20% of the river's average flow, and in seniority, they often predate the compact itself. Yet for most of the 20th century, tribes were left out of the room where allocation decisions were made. Some, like the Colorado River Indian tribes, still lack the infrastructure to deliver the water they are legally owed to their own communities. On paper, tribal nations are among the most senior rights holders on the river. In practice, many have waited a century to use water that was theirs from the start. And all of it rested on the premise that the river carried 16.5 million acre-feet per year. It did not. It never had. And the trees knew first. At the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, scientists extracted cores from ancient trees across the Colorado River basin. Each ring preserved a year's worth of climate data, wide rings for wet years, narrow for dry. By matching patterns across hundreds of samples and cross-dating them to account for missing or false rings, they reconstructed stream flow records going back more than 500 years. The results were devastating. The period the compact negotiators had relied upon, roughly 1899 through 1921, was not normal. It was one of the wettest stretches in at least 5 centuries. Tree ring data showed that decades-long dry periods with average flows below 13 to 14 million acre-feet were not unusual. They were common. The compact had not divided the river conservatively. It had divided a phantasm. As a 2007 National Academy's report put it, the combination of limited water supplies, rapidly increasing populations, warmer temperatures, and recurrent drought pointed to a future in which conflict among water users would prove endemic. Climate projections indicated the region would become drier still. Some scientists argued that the Southwest had already entered an era of steadily declining river flows, not a drought in the traditional sense, but an aridification, a permanent recalibration of what the river could deliver. Researchers at the University of Colorado later quantified just how much warming alone was driving the decline. Roughly half of the flow loss since 2000 came not from reduced snowfall, but from higher temperatures, which dry out soils, pull moisture from spring snowpack before it can run off, and increase evaporation from the reservoirs themselves. A warmer atmosphere was, in effect, drinking the river before it ever reached Lake Powell. Every additional degree of warming was estimated to cost the basin roughly another 4 to 5% of its flow. A mechanism with no compact, no negotiating table, and no seat at Bishop's Lodge. The trees had been keeping records longer than the government. The trees were right. Meanwhile, the way the water was actually being used made the math even worse. Across the Colorado River Basin, roughly 80% of the water went to agriculture. And according to peer-reviewed research, a staggering 70% of that agricultural water irrigated livestock feed crops, alfalfa, other hays, and corn silage. The basin shipped an estimated $880 million worth of hay overseas each year, most of it to China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. The Saudi detail alone could carry an entire documentary. In 2018, Saudi Arabia banned the cultivation of alfalfa on its own soil, specifically to conserve water. Then a Saudi multinational called the Al Marai Company purchased 10,000 acres of farmland in Arizona to grow the same crop using groundwater and Colorado River supplies. The alfalfa was shipped back to Saudi Arabia to support Saudi dairy operations. America was draining its most critical river to grow cattle feed for a country that had eliminated the same crop at home because it used too much water. Cities under pressure to cut consumption were quick to point out the imbalance. Urban Las Vegas had invested hundreds of millions in conservation, recycling indoor wastewater, paying homeowners to rip out lawns, reducing per capita water use dramatically. But cities used only 20% of the river. The 80% that went to agriculture was the elephant in the room. And no one at the negotiating table wanted to be the one to say that alfalfa for overseas cattle was worth more than drinking water for Phoenix. Las Vegas, to its credit, did not wait for someone else to solve the problem. It drilled. In 2008, the Southern Nevada Water Authority launched what became known as the Third Straw Project. The existing 2 intake pipes in Lake Mead drew water at elevations that were increasingly vulnerable as the lake dropped. If the surface fell below those intakes, 2 million people and 40 million annual tourists would lose their water supply. The solution was to bore a new intake deeper, beneath the lake bed itself. A $25 million drilling rig, roughly the length of 2 football fields, was lowered in pieces 600 feet underground beneath Lake Mead's Saddle Island and reassembled. Over the next 6 years, it ground nearly 3 miles through solid rock toward an intake structure that had been lowered into the lake bottom and cemented in place with the equivalent of 1,200 truckloads of concrete. The 100-foot structure was capped by a 1,900-pound stainless steel hemisphere, the plug. The tunnel was tiled behind the drill with more than 2,400 curved concrete sections, each 14 inches thick. The result was a clean 20-foot diameter tube big enough for a subway train, sloping gently from the bottom of a vertical shaft to the lake floor intake. The new straw tapped the lake at 860 feet above sea level, 190 feet below the highest existing intake. It cost $817 million, took more than 6 years, and claimed 1 worker's life. On September 23, 2015, an 8.6-ton steel ball was hoisted to a barge and pulled from the intake structure, flooding the tunnel. It's a milestone. We're ready for operation, Project Chief Jim Nickerson said. The pipeline would not draw any more water from the lake than before, or make the surface level drop faster. It was not designed to take more. It was designed to reach deeper. Noah Hoyfs, a project manager for the Water Authority, put it plainly. You turn on the tap. You don't think about it. These are the things being done in order to live the lifestyle we want in the places we want to live. Las Vegas spent $817 million not to get more water, but to chase the water that was leaving. That is not adaptation. That is infrastructure running after a retreating resource on a river where every drop was already promised to someone else. By 2023, the crisis had moved from the reservoir to the negotiating table. California, Arizona, and Nevada struck a deal to cut at least 3 million acre-feet of water use through 2026, roughly 10% of their combined allocation. About half the cuts were to be completed by the end of 2024. Most were compensated with more than $1 billion in federal funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. Farmers would be paid to fallow fields. Tribes and cities would be compensated for voluntary reductions. It was called historic. It was also temporary. The agreement ran through 2026, when the existing reservoir operating rules were set to expire. The 7 basin states were supposed to negotiate a new long-term framework to replace them. They had 3 years. They failed. Deadlines came and went. Arizona refused to sign an agreement that didn't include mandatory cuts for the upper basin states. Colorado's representative countered that upper basin states were already constrained by nature. They couldn't use water that wasn't falling as snow. Behind the public statements lay a deeper asymmetry the compact had never resolved. The upper basin states delivered water passively, constrained by whatever snow fell in a given year. The lower basin states, and California and Arizona especially, had built entire economies, cities, farms, industries, on the assumption of a fixed delivery regardless of what fell in the mountains. Asking the lower basin to cut felt to its representatives like being punished for planning. Asking the upper basin to guarantee more felt to its representatives like being asked to conjure snow. Both sides were right, and the river did not care which. California's top negotiator, J.B. Hamby, said what everyone already knew, but no one wanted to formalize. The Colorado River no longer reliably produces enough water to support all the uses and expectations built around it. In August 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation stepped in and imposed a 2-year operating framework. The lower basin states could face collective cuts of up to 3 million acre-feet per year, enough to supply roughly 9 million American families. It was the outcome Delph Carpenter had designed the 1922 compact specifically to prevent, the federal government dictating terms because the states could not agree. As of late August 2026, Lake Powell sat at roughly 25% capacity. Glen Canyon Dam, which was never designed to operate at such low water levels, was already suffering damage to its lower outlets. The Bureau had begun emergency water transfers from upstream reservoirs, including Flaming Gorge in Utah, to keep Powell functional. Lake Mead was projected to drop to 1,037 feet by mid-2027, breaking the 2022 record of 1,041 feet. The combined storage in both reservoirs was at its lowest point since 1957. Hydropower was failing alongside water supply. Glen Canyon Dam's turbines, engineered to operate within a specific band of reservoir elevation, were approaching the point at which they could no longer generate electricity at all, a threshold known within the Bureau as minimum power pool. Hoover Dam, downstream, faced a version of the same math. Together, the 2 dams powered irrigation pumps, municipal water systems, and homes across 6 states. Every foot the reservoirs dropped chipped away at output millions of people relied on without ever thinking about where their electricity originated. The river that could no longer reliably fill a canal was now struggling to keep the lights on in the cities built to drink it. The bathtub ring was not just a visual curiosity anymore. It was a measurement of a century's worth of overcommitment, etched into the canyon walls in white mineral deposit, plainly visible to every tourist who drove across the dam. Below the dam, the river continued south, past the Grand Canyon, past the irrigated fields of Arizona, past Yuma, past the border. And 1 mile into Mexico, it reached the place this story began, Morelos Dam, where the last of the Colorado is diverted into a canal and the riverbed goes dry for 90 miles to the sea. The delta that once held 2 million acres of wetland, forest, and life was still cracked mud and salt. The Cocopah were still there. The channel was still empty. But in 2014, something happened that proved the cruelest point of all. Under a binational agreement called Minute 319, the United States and Mexico released a pulse flow of water from Morelos Dam. It was not much, 158,000 acre-feet, less than 1% of the river's average annual flow. But that water traveled nearly 100 miles through the dead delta. Vegetation bloomed in days, birds returned, cottonwood and willow seedlings took root. Communities in Mexico held festivals on the riverbanks. Children played in water they had never seen in the channel. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the Colorado River reached the Gulf of California again. Then the water stopped. The agreement expired. The delta dried out again. Scientists who monitored the pulse called it a natural experiment nobody had dared run before. What happens if you simply give a dead river back a fraction of what was taken? The answer arrived almost immediately. Groundwater levels beneath the delta rose. Native cottonwood and willow, species that had all but vanished from the corridor, outcompeted by salt-tolerant tamarisk once the natural flooding cycle stopped, germinated in dense stands along the banks. Bird surveys recorded increases in species richness within the first breeding season. None of it required new engineering, new pipelines, or new dams. It required only that a small percentage of water be allowed to keep moving instead of being diverted. Minute 319 was followed by a smaller successor agreement, Minute 323, which promised additional environmental flows through 2026. But the volumes were modest, dependent on binational funding that arrived in fits and starts, and always secondary to the agricultural and municipal deliveries upstream. The delta was allowed to live, briefly, on whatever was left over. It was never allowed to live on a guarantee. The river carved the Grand Canyon. It sustained civilizations for thousands of years. 7 men divided it in a lodge near Santa Fe, using the highest water numbers from the wettest years in 5 centuries. A dam killed 96 workers to hold it back. A messiah drowned its canyons in the name of progress. Farmers used more of it than entire states and shipped the harvest overseas. A city spent $817 million drilling deeper into a lake that was leaving. And when less than 1% of its flow was returned to the delta, the land came back to life in days, proof that the river was never dead, only stolen. At Morelos Dam, the Colorado still stops. 90 miles of dry riverbed stretch between the last concrete structure and the sea. Cracked earth under a desert sky in a country promised 1.5 million acre-feet that barely receives a fraction. A 1,450-mile river that carved the deepest canyon on the continent cannot finish its own journey. Upstream, the reservoirs keep dropping. The states keep arguing. The alfalfa keeps shipping overseas. And the math, 104 years later, is still wrong.